to the Title V Statement of Basis webinar by EPA Region 5. The purpose of this webinar is to provide an overview of important elements and benefits of a Title V permit statement of basis. We did want to emphasize we are focusing on Title V permits statement of basis. We will not be discussing statement of basis for other permits such as construction permits, even though such permits have statement of basis and they're important too. But for the purposes of this webinar, we are focusing solely on Title V. I'm Sam Portanova, and I've been with EPA Region 5 since 1991. I've worked in the Air and Radiation Division since joining EPA back in '91. Currently, I'm one of Region 5's Ohio permitting contacts. Prior to working with Ohio permits, I was a contact for Indiana permits for a number of years. And I also focus on PSD and NSR issues here in the region.
Great. And I'm Beth Valenziano. I've almost worked for EPA as long as Sam. Started just a few months after he did in '91. Primarily work on the Title V operating permit program, and I am Michigan's Region 5 contact. And my focus tends to be on broader implementation issues where Title V interfaces with other Clean Air Act provisions like Clean Air Markets or toxics enforcement and things like that.
Okay. And before we get into our the content of our webinar, I'll just go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, we do have two ways to access audio via a conference line and also directly through the computer. We will be muting the phone lines just to avoid feedback or just background noise. But if anyone needs to raise something to us, please use the chat window, or just for any, or even if you're running into technical problems. This webinar, the target audience for this webinar is Region 5 state air permitting staff with 3 years or less experience. Now, obviously, if people have more experience than that, wonderful, but that's just the target audience. That's what this is aimed at. If you have any questions as we go along, please submit them using the chat window. I think our plan is to not stop after each slide to answer questions, so we'll most likely answer questions at the end of various sessions in order to keep the webinar moving along. So we are making a PDF of today's slides available. They should be available now in the download window, and I believe that should be in the lower left on your screen. And there's also, you'll see there's a second attachment. It's a guidance document. You'll see it listed near the end of the presentation, but it's the file is a Statement of Basis Webinar 10-9. So that's the one you should be able to see now and download. We'll leave the webinar active maybe for perhaps about 10 or 15 minutes after the presentation to allow time for people to download if you're not able to do that right now. And also we plan to email the PDF file to everyone who registered for this webinar. We'll do that after, subsequent to this presentation. And finally, we want to let you know that we want to hear feedback from you. That helps us gauge if we're heading in the right direction with these webinars and help us plan for future webinars. So there will be a link to a survey. Is that correct? Yes. Is it at the end of the webinar? Right. Okay. So there will be a link there. Please, do that survey. That would be a great service to us. And also, the results will be emailed to everyone who registered. And I think we're also going to email out the survey link too to the people who registered. Okay. Yeah, just a quick snapshot. Before we get started, we have two poll questions here to get a flavor of who's in attendance today. So the first question is which state you are from, and the second is your number of years of experience. So please select your response now. Okay. Well, it looks like Michigan's in the lead. So and as far as experience, looks like we've got a good number of people at 10 plus years, and then maybe a quarter for the middle range and a quarter for the early, the newer staff. And that's fine. Even though this is targeted for newer staff, we welcome anyone to listen in. I think everyone's probably had enough time, so we'll actually move on to the part of the presentation. First, just as a point of clarification up front, we wanted to let you know that for these documents, EPA guidance and petition responses, and actually I think EPA rules also say statement of basis. However, there is no one correct name for this document. And as you can see, we have a table up there, and you can see our states use a wide variety of names to call these documents: technical support documents, preliminary determination, and so forth. So there is no right way to call these, but for simplicity's sake, for this presentation, we're only going to use the term statement of basis. Okay, so the following lists the regulatory reasons to have a statement of basis. In Part 70, the Title V rules, 70.7A5 is the part of the rule that establishes legal requirement for a Title V permit to have a statement of basis. And also, you'll see the second item, 70.8C. This section is in regards to grounds for EPA objection to a permit. In this section, paragraph C3.2 mentions failure to submit information necessary to adequately review a permit. And if you look at this section, it does not explicitly mention statement of basis, but in a number of petition responses by EPA, failing to have an adequate statement of basis is, this section is cited as grounds for objection, so it is tied to statement of basis content, or has been in the past. And there have been a number of EPA petition responses that affirm our position about having an adequate statement of basis. We list two here: Fort James, Camas Mill, and Onyx Environmental Services, but we have a longer list of 8 that will be on a slide near the end of the presentation. And there should be hyperlinks, so the PDF should have active hyperlinks to take you directly to those petitions. Okay, so in the first session we'll talk about reasons to have a statement of basis other than the fact that it's required under Part 70. But before we begin, let's get some input from the audience on why you think having a statement of basis is important, outside of the regulatory requirement. But so we have 5 choices here, and you can click more than one. So you go ahead and click each of the ones you think are correct. Okay. Well, it looks like each of them are getting a good number of checks. Looks like explains applicability or non-applicability determinations gets the most. And the last one gets 0. So, and rightfully so, the first four are correct. We've identified for having a statement of basis. And so thanks for responding, and so let's move on. So one way to look at a statement of basis is that it is a roadmap for the permit. A statement of basis provides an explanation for permit conditions. Not only does it identify legal and factual basis for permit requirements, but a good statement of basis also identifies key issues in a permit that reviewers should be aware of. A statement of basis also clarifies the decision-making process for applicability and technical issues. So what that means is good examples of those are monitoring decisions or applicability or non-applicability determinations. For example, MACT standards, maybe a MACT non-applicability determination. And also a statement of basis should include important background information for the source, such as permitting history and other important facts. We'll get into a little more details on that as we move along with the webinar. For everyone, has EPA granted a petition based on the lack of statement of basis within the permit? Please take a moment. Okay, looks like overwhelming yes. Okay, I think we can move on. Actually, that's sort of a trick question because the answer is actually no, because in petition responses, what's been at issue is the lack of a sufficient permit record for a permitting decision, and not the lack of a statement of basis itself. And that's been the reason for granting petitions in the past. EPA has taken this position in a few permits, and I actually put up a quote. It might be very wordy up there on the screen, but I just thought it was a pretty good quote, and I highlighted the important text. But this is from the Los Medanos Energy Center petition. This is from 2004. And I thought this said it well as far as what's truly the underlying reason. So it's technically not that they have a lack of a statement of basis, period, but without one, I mean, you're gonna run into these problems under 70.8C. Okay, well, now next let's take a look at how having a good statement of basis benefits state staff. And one way to look at it is it's a gift to your future self, and not only you specifically, but other permit writers or inspectors or other state staff. And this will come in handy for, in particular for future permit mods or when the permit's up for renewal. This was actually mentioned in one of the petitions that that this helps assure that future generations of permit writers are able to understand what occurred in past permitting actions. So that definitely helps yourself and your colleagues. Also, a well-documented decision-making in a statement of basis could promote consistency between permits. So if you had a complex issue, and if it's well-documented, then that can be very informative for other permits within your state if similar issues arise. And also, if you have a well-written statement of basis, that may be beneficial in the event that a permit is appealed or petitioned. And if that happens, then a well-documented justification for various decisions could help support your case in defending that appeal. Okay, now we're gonna just take a quick survey. There's no right or wrong answer to this, but just want to get a snapshot of how permit staff approaches developing a statement of basis. Statement of basis first, then develop the permit, or do you do the permit first, then the statement of basis, or do you go back and forth between the two documents? Okay. Interesting that it looks like it's 0 for the first approach, but maybe a slight majority go back and forth. Okay. Okay. Well, then we can move on. So we talked about benefits to the state permitting authority, but having a good statement of basis also benefits other interested parties. So we're talking about the public, US EPA, enviro groups, and one benefit is that a well-written statement of basis should highlight elements that outside parties would find important to review. And this was mentioned in a couple of petition responses. The Onyx petition mentioned that, and also one for Port Hudson, and both of those are linked in a subsequent slide. A good statement of basis also helps interested parties better understand permit terms and conditions. This is especially useful because the reviewers out there aren't always experts either on permitting matters, maybe regulatory matters, or on technical issues. So having a well explained statement of basis certainly helps in that regard. It also a statement of basis for the audience will provide some clarity and transparency to draft permit conditions. It helps them connect the dots for why certain decisions were made. And then in the end, ultimately, the ideal result is that having a well-written statement of basis will lead to a more informed and meaningful public review process. So that means perhaps getting fewer adverse comments, or maybe fewer requests for clarifications, or maybe the comments you get are more meaningful. That they actually isn't just based on just not being informed or not understanding something. Okay, now we're just going to have a quick true-false. Language in a statement of basis serves as an enforceable requirement for the source. Okay, well, looks like it's unanimous there, false, which is good because that's the right answer. Yep. So statement of basis language does not serve as an enforceable requirement for the source and does not establish legal obligations. A statement of basis should not be seen as a rewrite of the permit itself. That Onyx petition actually has a pretty good statement. It says, rather than restating the permit, it should list anything that deviates from simply a straight recitation of applicable requirements. And also, just as a cautionary note, treating statement of basis language as enforceable could create legal ambiguities down the road for the permit. And here's an additional thought when developing a statement of basis. And this actually is from a Title V response for a source called Doe Run Company Buick Mill and Mine from 2002. And what they say is that the permit writer should keep in mind that each reviewer among the interested parties is going to have a different level of expertise. So the permit writer is under no obligation to try to write a statement of basis that satisfies everyone's experience level. That would basically be an impossible task. But the permit writer should try to strike an even balance when developing the statement of basis to try to make it as useful as possible to the general audience. Okay, I think we're about ready to turn it over to Beth next.
Yeah, we'll give Sam a break here, and you can hear me for a while. So first, a humble word here. For the next section of this presentation, I'm going to be going through a laundry list of potential statement of basis content items and examples illustrating the items. And this list compiles content topics from all the different guidances and petitions on the resource pages that Sam has mentioned are at the end of the presentation. The following statement of basis content slides really should be viewed as a best practice list. It's not intended to dictate this level of detail for every Title V action. And also, as Sam discussed, we recognize that some of this information can be just addressed directly in the permit, and it doesn't necessarily need to be repeated in a statement of basis. However, though, depending on the type or complexity of the source or the level of public interest, additional detail in the statement of basis can be beneficial. Also, remember that if you have any questions about the statement of basis content, you can always reach out to your Region 5 state contacts because they'll be able to guide you through and provide advice that's more state-specific in nature. Now, our hope is that this list and the examples will inspire you to make improvements to your statement of basis content, and that you can also use these content slides basically as checklists of things to consider including. Your future self and the permit writers that follow you will be eternally grateful. And me, when I review your permit. All right, so probably the first part of your statement of basis is an overview and introductory section addressing big picture stuff. So a good intro section, it's a way to address basic questions before they're even asked. And in that sense, it can be a time saver for you because it reduces inquiries because the document directly provides these basic answers. So the overview section is likely mostly boilerplate, and it would answer questions like, what is this statement of basis document thing? And, what is Title V? And what's this permit about? What type of permit action is this? Is it initial, renewal, modification? What type of modification? What's going on? And also, including a description of how the permit is organized helps reviewers understand, how to read the permit and where to find everything. Sometimes these documents are pretty big, right? And this can also vary a lot by state, how they're structured. We can become really comfortable with the permit structure of the state program that we're used to and we work in, and forget that it's not necessarily straightforward to everybody else how to navigate these documents. So, if you doubt that, pick up a permit from a different state and tell me you don't feel a little disoriented and confused when you're out of your state element. So here's an example of some statement of basis content addressing what the Title V program is. So yes, this is basic stuff, but it can really help set the stage for reviewers who are not familiar with your Title V program. And you can see that the language provides a basic overview addressing who has to get a permit, that it's an operating permit for air pollution requirements, and it includes references to federal, state statutes and rules where someone can learn more about the program. And note also that the language addresses what goes into the permit and the purpose of the permit, which is helpful to set reviewers' expectations and also to direct reviewers not familiar with Title V away from those types of comments and inquiries along the lines of, you shouldn't let the source operate, or you should require more stringent limits. It kind of gives you a sense of what Title V is trying to do here. So another upfront section of the statement of basis would be an area describing the specific source. And note that some of these things can be addressed directly by the permit, as we had said, and there may not be a need to repeat it. But sometimes it can be helpful to summarize or consolidate information in the statement of basis too. So as we said, it's a balance of time and resources, of complexity of the source, of public interests, etc. So with that, the source description content can include a description of what the source does. You know, it's an electric utility, a widget manufacturer, a coder, a printing facility, for example. It can include summaries of the source's actual and potential emissions of criteria pollutants, as well as aggregate and individual hazardous air pollutants. A description of the air emissions related units and groups of units. A description of insignificant activities. A description of control equipment, including which units have controls and which pollutants they control. Oftentimes we don't see that level of detail. Identification of any stationary source determinations, which could either address why multiple facilities are one stationary source, or conversely why multiple facilities are considered separate sources. And for permitting authorities that issue separate Title V permits to the same stationary source, the statement of basis can identify any other Title V permits covering that source. Okay, so here's an example of a source description. I'll start it scrolling in a second. Apologies for this example being so long. You don't really have to read it as much as to get a sense of its content as it scrolls. And I wanted to include a longer example and one example that will give you a fuller sense of the scope of content, because the rest of the examples that we highlight in this presentation, they're simplified really in order to fit within the structure that is PowerPoint. So to give you a flavor here, there it goes. So the first paragraph here summarizes the types of wastes that this landfill accepts. It gives an overview of the air pollutants generated. Next, there's a description of the different areas of the landfill, which are closed, which are accepting waste, which one's new and not operational. And then there's a summary of the gas collection and control system. And if that wasn't enough, here's even more source description for the same landfill. So in addition to the landfill itself, the statement of basis also summarizes the other permitted emission units, including a wood-fired boiler, a waste oil heater, a fuel storage tank, and a couple of emergency engines. And then finally, there's a description of leachate storage and treatment, including possibly related odor issues that are useful to keep track of. And then one good sidebar tip here too is to identify the units in the statement of basis by the same naming conventions used in the permit, because that makes it much easier to find related information between the statement of basis and the permit. Okay, so we're going to try an interactive exercise here. This is going to be interesting with the number of folks on here. We're going to try something new. So instead of a poll box, I'm going to let you, the viewers, basically draw on the slide to represent your input. Hopefully this works, and please don't do anything that will get me in trouble. Thank you. So we've enabled a drawing taskbar on your screen that should now appear as a vertical black bar. And you can click on the rectangle figure there that I've kind of highlighted on the slide. Now in beta testing, some people have single click works, and for other folks they need to double click to select it. And then what you should see next is this horizontal bar that it enables, and it's really hard to see, but there is a little check mark. So go ahead and click the check mark to choose it. And now your cursor is basically a check mark stamp, and you can graffiti all over the slide. So just try it out. Just randomly click somewhere. Let's just see if this is actually working. Sweet. All right. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks for that. Now, there's how many people here? There's good 75 people on here, so save space for everybody else. All right, so we're going to move forward. Everybody stop. Don't do that. You're going to get me in trouble. Okay, so here's the poll. Listen to the instructions before you start graffitiing. So here's the same list of source description items that we just discussed. And with your check stamp cursor, click a check next to any of these items that you personally find helpful. So I kind of try to put them to the right of each one, you know, so you can kind of get a visual vote. So the idea here, like I say, is just to kind of get a visual snapshot for folks on, you know, which of these things you find useful in a statement of basis in describing the source. Great. Cool, so you can see the trends here and which ones, control equipment, stationary source determinations are getting lots of votes, describing the units, the activities, actual emissions. All right, so we're going to disable draw for now. If you're good, we'll let you draw again later. Let me get back. Okay, so next category topic. Statement of basis can have a section describing the source's location, including notable geographic and topographic information, surrounding land use, you know, whether it's urban, residential, industrial, agricultural, recreational. And the description can also address the National Ambient Air Quality Standard attainment and non-attainment status. Now, here's an example that incorporates geographic and land use information details that gives a reviewer a good sense of the source's rural location. So just from the simple information provided here, you know the source's address and county, that there's a medium-sized town 3 miles away, as is the National Lake Shore. There's a campground, some small businesses nearby, along with another manufacturing facility next door, and a smaller town's a mile away. So, you know, just from this short paragraph, you get a good picture of the source's location. Okay, so next category, source history. You can include a description of the source's relevant history, such as unique source information and new source review or construction permitting history. And, you know, the statement of basis is a great place to include information that's necessary to maintain institutional knowledge. You know, whether it's yours, you know, you might think you'll remember, but it's really impossible to retain it all. Just ask me and Sam after being here for 27 years. You know, or your successors, the person who gets this permit after you do. Now, for renewals, the statement of basis can address what's different from the previous permit, such as changes to the source's activities and emission units, or new or revised applicable requirements, updates, clarifications to the permit language, and removed or no longer applicable requirements. And, you know, as a reviewer, I find that this source history information and the changes to the permit can really help focus my review on the changes made since last permit issuance. It can also help identify permit content that's not been updated and perhaps should be updated. For example, where the permit writer has, you know, incorporated the most recent template language that the state uses, or whether the permit reflects any revised standards like MACs, which tend to get revised over time, or whether the permit just contains older language that would benefit from further clarification. And here's an example of a description of changes since the last permit renewal. So now anyone reviewing the permit knows there was construction permitting activity for a new foam line, that the new line replaced lines 1 and 2. And, you know, there's no question when reviewing the permit about whether lines 1 and 2 were accidentally dropped out of the permit or whether those lines could start up again. And so you have a very basic understanding of the changes to the source, nicely summarized for you. All right, folks, it's graffiti time again. Where's our draw? So here, I'll flip that on. Okay, so let's try this. The question is, click a check mark next to any of the source history topics that you already routinely include in the statement of basis. So when you yourself are writing, do you ever, which of these do you include? Cool. So it looks like there's lots of votes for just that generic. Oh, now everybody's coming in. Wow, you guys write great statement of basis. Thank you. That's cool. I was curious to see whether there would be trends of certain items being used more than others. That looks like all of these folks are capturing. That's great. All right. Okay, so another category of statement of basis content is the source's compliance history. And this can include, information about the source's compliance status, and, the existence of any active settlement documents, such as consent decrees or, administrative orders, agreements, as well as whether the settlement resulted in any permanent applicable requirements that need to go into the permit. And it can also provide information on any publicly available information regarding any ongoing enforcement actions. And again, publicly available is key here. And whether the permit has any placeholder language or for any unresolved compliance or applicability issues. And next, our example here. So this example can fall into several categories actually, because it's a description of controls and applicable requirements as well as compliance status. And you can see here how it's describing the landfill's gas collection and control system, and also how that system is going to be utilized to ensure compliance with the new source performance standard. Okay, so the next statement of basis content area I'm going to discuss is Title V applicability. This section ideally should list all of the criteria that makes the particular source subject to Title V. Often the statement of basis will identify only one or some of these. It'll say they're major, for example, and not say much else. But it's best to include all of the breadcrumbs when identifying why that they're subject. If you only include one criteria, for example, and that changes in the future, then there's not enough information in the statement of basis supporting the complete applicability determination. So this could mean that either the other criteria get overlooked when a change happens, and the source is incorrectly taken out of Title V, or that the permit staff have to start from scratch to document the source's ongoing applicability. So fully documenting why the source has to get the Title V permit will reduce future burden and potentially overlooking any other applicability criteria in the future. So let's quickly run through the list of reasons why a source might be subject to Title V, because this would be what you'd address in the statement of basis. The main criteria obviously is being major for either criteria pollutants or hazardous air pollutants. Be sure to specifically identify which pollutants, not just that they're major, but what they're major for. In addition, some non-major sources are required to get a Title V permit if the underlying new source performance standard or toxic standard they're subject to requires them to come into Title V. Also, Section 129 of the Clean Air Act requires all sources subject to solid waste incinerator rules to be subject to Title V, regardless of major source status. These can be in the form of new source performance standards or for existing sources, their 111D plans. And also, sources required to obtain major source construction permits are subject to Title V. Now, this category is often overlooked because these sources are almost always still major. But sometimes the backed or layer-controlled source has minor emissions as a result of those controls. And Title IV acid rain sources are subject to Title V, this being another category that usually overlaps with major source, but again, sometimes utility peakers have taken synthetic minor limits to avoid major source status. And with that, here's your example of a Title V applicability, which identifies the landfill new source performance standard as the applicability trigger. Alrighty, next category. The statement of basis can identify information pertaining to the applicable requirements that the source is subject to, as well as which units are subject to those requirements. It can be a helpful clarifier. The applicable requirement information could include any source specifics impacting applicability, any formal applicability determinations, any relevant rules or guidance. And, documenting applicability information means that nobody has to recreate this information or duplicate resources. It gives everyone a common ground starting point. And again, we note that this is a balance of resources. This can be dependent on how straightforward any particular applicability issues are. But especially where things are complex, it's good to put some information in the statement of basis documenting that. Also, summarizing what the source is subject to can help the reader, the reviewer, and also the next permit writer, understand what's in the permit. So here's some categories of the different applicable requirements that could be used to organize the discussion in the statement of basis. So that'd be whether they have any construction permits, what their state implementation plan requirements are, whether there's any federal standards they're subject to, the new source performance standards or NESHAP's toxics requirements. And then some of these federal standards provide multiple compliance options that the statement of basis could describe what the source is doing for those standards. There's also, as I mentioned, some existing source standards under Section 111D. There's compliance assurance monitoring, identification of any potential to omit limits, which could address any practical enforceability considerations and also address what requirements that the source is avoiding. Any state-only requirements, such as state toxics programs. And here, a good way to keep track of what's not supposed to be federally enforceable is to point them out in the statement of basis. We often see discrepancies in the permits regarding state-only identifiers in the permits. It's often just a cut and paste issue, but it has big legal ramifications. And finally, the summary can address any exemptions from applicable requirements. So like I said, this list is a way to try to organize all the different types of applicable requirements and give you a structure for the statement of basis to address these things. Okay, so here's some statement of basis example language addressing an applicable requirement. And here it identifies a unit that's subject to the Miscellaneous Metal Parts Coding MACT, which is Quad M. It also identifies the compliance option chosen for that MACT. And then next it identifies that the same unit is also subject to the Plastic Parts Surface Coating MACT, which is Quad P. Then goes on to explain that the Quad M emission limit is also used to comply with the Quad P limit, and it cites where in the MACT rules that you can do this. So, you can see that having this summary in the statement of basis can save everybody a lot of time trying to, understand what the source is subject to and how they're complying. Okay, another big topic area for the statement of basis is monitoring. This can include a description of the monitoring and also the underlying authority for the monitoring, such as whether it's directly from the emission standard, whether there was an alternative monitoring approval for that source, whether it's compliance assurance monitoring or Title V monitoring. And it also would include clear documented rationale for the monitoring. More on this in a minute. And also, sometimes this is overlooked, but the statement of basis can also justify why a condition includes no monitoring or no apparent direct monitoring anyway, such as when a unit is incapable of emitting over a permitted limit, or in some cases, there could be other requirements associated with the emission limit that the statement of basis can connect the dots to. Such as a requirement for only using natural gas fuel or operation and maintenance requirements for the unit, for example, that actually are associated with compliance with a limit. Now, a little more about monitoring justification. We could fill a whole webinar getting into the detail here, so I'm not planning to do that. You're welcome. But I did want to give you an idea of the types of things that can be relevant when justifying monitoring approaches. So, I put this slide together so you can use it as a reference for the types of things to consider addressing. Note that many Title V permit petitions allege insufficient monitoring or lack of information in the permit record regarding monitoring. So when a permit is petitioned, it raises the bar as far as necessary detail in the statement of basis, documenting the permitting authority's choice of monitoring and supporting why it's sufficient. So many of the Title V petitions that we cite in the resources at the end of this presentation speaks to exactly that, these issues of monitoring justification and the permit record. And note too that just stating in the statement of basis that monitoring is sufficient is not considered adequate justification. All right, so here's a monitoring justification example. And what's happening here is that the carbon monoxide continuous emission monitoring is being used as a surrogate for the volatile organic compounds limits. And you can see here how it discusses the relationship between the emissions and the correlated staff test data. All right, are we ready for some more graffiti here? So let's try another poll. Read first. So here's the basic list of monitoring statement of basis content items that we just went through. Let's say you were just assigned a permit renewal for a complex source and the previous permit writer has retired. So you can't go and ask her what she did and why. So put a check mark under, there's room under here. Put a check mark under the items you hope are addressed in the existing statement of basis for your inherited permit. What are these? What's going to help you? Yay. So this is good. This is affirmation that even as a permit writer that you can see that having this information in the statement of basis is going to help you as a permit writer. Thanks, guys. All right, I know what you're thinking. Thank goodness there's only 2 bullets on this slide. Beth cannot possibly talk for much longer. And you're right, I can't, but let's wrap up some of our last categories here. So next up here is Permit Shield. The Permit Shield, it's a legal mechanism that affects whether something can be enforced against a source. And generally it protects the source if there's an error in the permit. It comes with a whole host of exceptions and caveats. That's a webinar for another day. But more importantly for the statement of basis, the Permit Shield has a non-applicability component where the permit can identify requirements that the source is not subject to. And if it's done properly, those requirements then cannot be enforced against the source. So a key to a proper non-applicability shield is either that the permit or the statement of basis must provide the specific analysis identifying why the conditions don't apply. And here's a simple example analysis justifying why an applicable requirement doesn't apply for purpose of granting the shield. I picked an easy one here. The units are the same. It's just kind of what fit on the slide. But things of note here, that the justification addresses the specific applicability provisions in the new source performance standard that are the basis for the decision, including the rule citation. And in this case, it is the size of the tanks, the installation date of the tanks, and specifically addressing any changes to the units with respect to NSPS's reconstruction or modification provisions. So it's tying it right to the applicability provisions in the NSPS. All right, next I've grouped together some operational flexibility items. Now, these things don't come up in many permits, but they are helpful to address in the statement of basis when they are used. And we're really only going to highlight streamlining today because it tends to be a little more common. But if you have questions about the other concepts, let us know, or you can reach out to your Region 5 state contacts. So streamlining, it stems from EPA's White Paper 2, Guidance on Title V Implementation. And basically it says that, if a source is subject to multiple overlapping requirements, streamlining provides that the source can meet the multiple requirements by just complying with the most stringent consolidated provisions. And then the other requirements are considered to be subsumed within that streamline limit. And streamlining requires the permitting authority to provide an analysis in the statement of basis that verifies that the streamlined provisions really do capture the most stringent requirements. And I think I talked about this in the last example. This is what I was actually referring to streamlining earlier when I said the units were the same. I picked this simpler example where the limits were directly comparable. And here you can see that the example is identifying the unit, the 2 p.m. limits, the identification of the most stringent streamline limit and the stringency analysis, and subsume limit, and the underlying authority and rule citations for the limit. Okay, so another good thing to document in a statement of basis are changes to the permit as it moves from draft to proposed to its final form, as well as documenting responses to comments. And note that some permitting authorities do create a separate document for response to comments, while others include it as part of the statement of basis. But regardless of its location, it's an important part of the permit decision-making record. All right, so our last poll question. This one's in traditional form, no more graffiti. A lot of different potential content ideas to include in a statement of basis, and the question for you all is free form. Did we miss anything? Do you have any additional ideas? Do you know of other topics that your state includes in a statement of basis, or something that you would like to see? Any other ideas out there? Bueller? I have some examples on the next slide, but I was hoping for some folks to give us some ideas. Environmental justice, that's good. Yep, testing frequency, addressing justifications of monitoring. Sure. Yep, emission factors, that gets into the how are they complying, calculating, monitoring. Very good. Well, like I say, I had a couple of extras, which I will move on to. Thank you, guys. And here were a couple extra ideas. These were content ideas that are not specifically noted in guidance and petitions, but that we have seen and can be helpful. And that's to include contact information for the source and the permitting authority. You don't have to go back and dig through the applications to find stuff. Permit processing milestones. Again, you may have a separate system to keep track of that, but it might be nice to have it all in one place just for this source. And also we've seen the statement of basis used to document concerns and discussions raised by the permittee. So those are all the different categories of content that we wanted to run through. And before I turn it back over to Sam, I wanted to see if there was any questions that we should address at this time pertaining to any content ideas. Question here is, how about responses to public comments? And yeah, that was included in one of the last slides here, documentation of changes to the in-process permit. Are you popping that one up? So yeah, so you're right. And like I say, some states will have a separate response to comments document. Other states will address the response to comments as a subsection in the statement of basis. There it is. Thank you. So, well, like I say, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to type them in, and at the end we will run through anything that we get. All right. So with that, I was going to pass it back over to Sam.
Okay. Make sure we're on the right slide here. So I just wanted to make a few final points for our webinar today. First of all, we just want to acknowledge that states have differing approaches for the format of their statement of basis. Some states have a very detailed statement of basis, while others are their document is more concise. As long as the items we discussed today in the webinar are addressed in the statement of basis, there is no right approach. So, I mean, in other words, EPA doesn't have a litmus test. We're not counting the number of pages to see if it's an adequate statement of basis. It depends on whichever approach works best for your state and captures everything that needs to be addressed. And also, we did want to acknowledge the importance of templates. Most likely, every state uses one, I'm guessing, to help develop a statement of basis, because they're very useful in saving time. But we also did want to note that some templates may leave some room for customization that in situations where maybe additional information needs to be added to fit a particular permit's needs. Also, another thing we want to highlight was that states have a different way of revising statement of basis documents. So in some states, the initial statement of basis is issued with the draft permit, and it is revised throughout the permitting process until the permit is issued final. But in other states, the statement of basis that is issued with a draft permit is in and of itself a final document, and any subsequent changes as the permit goes to final are memorialized in an addendum or an appendix. So again, there's no right or wrong way, but just if you're looking at other states' permits, that might be important to note. On their statement of basis might address changes in a different way. Since we mentioned templates, that's another thing we want to just emphasize quickly, that they're very useful, but we did want to assure that states should provide some sort of mechanism for reviewing them from time to time to ensure that they remain relevant and clear, up to date. For example, a statement of basis may need to be changed as a result of regulatory changes or programmatic revisions. Also, perhaps a statement of basis needs to be changed or should be changed based on feedback that's received, either internally or externally. Maybe somebody, has some useful suggestions on how to improve the statement of basis, or maybe there's a lessons learned from the current template that may prompt a change. And also, but that being said, ideally, we believe that states should plan to have periodic reviews of templates to seek improvement as needed, so that the documents just keep up or continue to improve over time as through as states learn through the permitting process, maybe on ways to improve the documents. Okay, so we're near the end. So, but before we conclude, we want to point out some reference documents. So here we list 6 reference documents. There's 3 on this page, and then there'll be 3 on the next page. These are documents that we feel are pretty good resources about what should go into a statement of basis. I'd say maybe on this page, maybe the noteworthy is that 2014 EPA OIG memo. That brings up some good points, and I believe that might cite to some of the petition actions also. And here on the next page, here's a few more items. On the PDF that you get, they should all be hyperlinked. I believe one of the reference documents is not available online, so we included it as an attachment. There was a presentation that someone from EPA gave to a Mid-Atlantic local area, not an area agency, but their equivalent of LADCO out in the Mid-Atlantic states. So that's a useful document too. And then finally, we also have, whoops, I think I went too far. There we go. We have a list of 8 Title V petition responses that were granted on issues related to statement of basis content. So a few of these we mentioned during the presentation, but all of them, all 8 have some useful statements about statement of basis. And in the PDF, these should be hyperlinked. They should take you directly to the document, and we do have even the page number listed there that points to where specifically in the petition response the statement of basis issue comes up. And you know, in many cases it's related to monitoring, but there's other issues they bring up also. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So just wanted to open up the floor for anyone who has any questions or comments. Please type in any such questions or comments using the chat window.
Maybe we already answered every question that ever possibly could be.
All right.
Like I say, remember too, we've got your counterparts in our office here that work with your state directly, and you can always reach out to them as well.
Okay, and before we conclude, we also wanted to remind everyone that that we are seeking feedback from you on today's webinar. So we have a link available, I believe on this, is it on this screen? And also we will be sending out a link to the survey via email to everyone. So we encourage everyone to click on that link. It'll launch a survey, and if your input would be much appreciated. And then subsequently we will share the results of that feedback with the email list of participants that we have.
All right. So with that, we want to thank everybody for your time, and we appreciate your participation. That finishes us out. Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.